Welcome to today's Boss to Boss podcast. In our interviews, we feature great business people doing imaginative things in otherwise unimaginative markets, usually from the world of B2B. Today's interview is with a man who knows how to bring a brand to life no matter what the market, Chris West from Verbal Identity. Chris is a leading tone of voice specialist and the remarkable brain responsible for fine-tuning many of the world's most innovative and loved brands, from Alphabet's Moonshot factory to Mulberry. We'll be asking Chris about the importance of brand voice in B2B, whether brands should alter their tone from channel to channel, and the degree to which ROI can be attributed to those considerations. Chris, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Perhaps we could just kick off by you talking a little bit about the kind of work you do and the kind of people that you do that work for.
For sure. So when people say, what does Verbal Identity do? I always say we're a niche within a niche, almost, within one small corner of that even. So what I mean by that is certainly marketing services aren't a niche. They're a fundamental part of a big forward-thinking business. Within marketing services, you need to pay a lot of attention to the identity of your brand. And I don't just mean the physical manifestations, the asset and everything else. I mean the identity in the sense of behaviors, what you think, how you behave in certain situations, what you look like. Yeah. But within that brand identity niche, there is an even smaller niche, which is where we are. And as the name Verbal Identity would suggest, brands, businesses can create an identity for themselves through the language they use. In fact, they do create an identity for themselves through the language they use, whether they realize it or not. So that's the space we're in. And most marketing directors, CMOs or business leaders these days of B2B, B2C, professional services firms, most of them, if they want their brand to be differentiated and be more highly valued for what's special about them, they'll have somewhere a slide deck, which is normally 120 slides long, which are all the nuances of their visual identity, where the logo goes, what the color palette is, how we change our color palette for this space or that space, where we move the trademark to if we're in developing markets or developed markets and things like this. And then this has happened to me twice, actually, Dan. Slide 114 says brand tone of voice to be confirmed, TBC. And actually, that's kind of crazy these days, because what we see in the last 10 years is there are more and more channels in which brands and businesses can communicate with their stakeholders. And more of those channels are dominated by language. But that's not the key. I mean, everyone can kind of see that when you say it, but the key other thing to think about is that we're living in a world now where clients, consumers, the public stakeholders actually want to be in a conversation, two-way dialogue with the brands and the companies that they like. And we've moved from that old broadcast way. I used to be a copywriter on British Airways, and British Airways' central position back in the 90s was we fly everywhere, and if you want to fly anywhere, you have to fly with us. End of it. And it was a broadcast approach. And what we see in the 21st century is that consumers, clients, stakeholders want to be in a dialogue. And so those channels become really important. And what's critical for someone leading the identity or leading the communications for a large professional services firm, B2B firm, whatever it is, they have to know what their brand voice is. And they have to know how to use that in different channels. So that's the space we're in.
Awesome. And how receptive are these companies in your experience? Does there tend to be an attitude among some B2B and professional service organizations that all that stuff is kind of more of a consumer brand consideration, or are they generally pretty receptive to it?
I would say that some owners, leaders of those businesses are there already. And they'll say, I am sick of signing off version 12 instead of version 2 of this key piece of communications, and it's 3 weeks late. And what it means is that we're slowing down as a business, and actually we're missing some opportunities because we just don't have the heart or the will to go and do them or try them. So some of them are very aware of that. And someone's saying to them, wouldn't it be great to align all of your internal and external writers in one voice and give them the skills and give them the definition so they can write and have the framework so that what you mean by our brand voice is what they understand by our brand voice, and those two things are the same. Have a good enough framework to define that. I would say 1 in 10, 1 in 20 are at that advanced stage. I think a lot of the other people are more at the kind of frustrated and what should we do about it stage. So they'll say, I seem to be overwhelmed. I'm not even looking at what's going out in social media because I can't really control it anymore. There are some things which the board sign off, and that takes a huge disproportionate amount of their time, hugely expensive, and my time. My professional capital is involved in getting that across the line with them. Um, but they don't necessarily see that there could be any other way. That they might see that brand language is something that comes out of one or two people's heads and it can't really be shaped or metricized. So I would say those people, when you start to say there is a framework that can be agreed, it can be as rigorous, should be as rigorous as your other brand assets, your visual identity, anything else. And even that you can measure it, you can measure the performance, then suddenly I think they're very keen. I find very little resistance at that point.
You use the word rigorous there. I wonder how prescriptive is this stuff? Is it a case of saying, look, like, these are the words you're going to use. This is exactly how you're going to behave. This is exactly, how you're going to dress, etc., etc. Or is it about creating a kind of a looser framework within which people can operate in their own particular way? How prescriptive is this process?
Well, the process to get there, I would say, is well defined. What you do afterwards with it is well directed. And I would say, verbal identity, we talk about the magic and mechanics of language. There are some things that when you understand how language works, you and me speaking, what are we doing? You can, and I was tutored in linguistics before starting this and now contribute to the Open University linguistics course. There are some things which are really well defined and understood in how language works. But we talk about the magic and mechanics of language. So there are some things which are definitely mechanical, predictable, and there are some things which are that sparkle of amazing magic. And in a way, what we're trying to do is create a springboard or a set of guidelines or a set of boundaries so people can say this is the area in which we speak and we choose to say certain things in a particular way, and the rest of it, what we're trying to do is bring that magic into the space. So there is definitely a very formalized process to get there. That's to get a company's voice defined, and then there is rigor around what we have to define to make sure this is always us speaking. But then that opens up space for writers, and anyone with a keyboard is a writer, by the way, for writers to then start talking and bring some magic into it.
Is there an element of building this into the hiring process in the first place? Because presumably there's a limit to which you can control people's behavior or kind of get them to retrospectively adopt a certain, set of values, a certain tone of voice. Do companies need to be taking the framework that they build and then actually establishing some mechanisms within the recruitment process to ensure that they get as close as possible to the right kind of behavioural fits in the first place?
That's a really good question. The reason I say it is because I don't exactly know the answer. I can tell you some of the things I think, which is when you hire people into business, you are looking at certain skill sets and attitudes. And I think you probably could look at how would they communicate in a brand voice on our behalf. Now, you 100% do that if they're specifically in a communications role. But actually, you look at senior partners of, say, a law firm, really they're communicating on behalf of the business all the time, and they're going out to see in the old days, they're going out to see their clients. Your tech engineers at an IT firm, they're spending huge amounts of time face to face with your business's clients. So I don't know that you necessarily have to, for those people, kind of put them through a test of can you communicate in our brand voice? But I would certainly say that in every starter's package in those kind of businesses, just as you would say, these are behaviors we'd expect you from health and safety, these are behaviors we'd expect representing us. I think also you can say these are some of the ways that we communicate in language that really magnify our value to our clients and our stakeholders. So I would say in certain roles, definitely this needs to be part of the hiring process. But once people are hired, I think everyone should be immersed and given the skills, speaking in the brand language.
You touched upon a really interesting point there, because I must admit, when we first started having this conversation, I was thinking very much in terms of tweets and, e-shots and Facebook updates, and but of course, what you've touched upon, a really important point. Probably 90% of a brand's communication happens when kind of nobody's looking, right? It could be over a phone, it could be a one-to-one email, it could be an interaction at a networking event between two people. So I guess that's an important consideration, is actually the different channels that actually kind of fall within this framework.
Oh, yeah. And there is nothing scarier for someone trying to push a business forward and get it highly valued by its commercial community than hearing the CEO speak with one voice, the managing partner speaking with another voice, and people looking after accounts communicating in an entirely different way about what the business is, what it stands for. So actually, from top to bottom and from left to right, everyone these days is communicating on behalf of the business. And they're communicating in the kind of the ways they behave. You go into an Apple store, people communicate in a particular way about Appleness in just the way they greet you and how they interact with you. But also in that Apple store, the way they speak, the kind of analogies they use, the kind of brand tone of voice they use is really consistent, and it would be consistent with what you see if you went to headquarters, and it's consistent everywhere across the business. And there's no reason why a professional services firm or a B2B firm shouldn't look for that consistency.
I guess you could almost argue that it's maybe even more important, because for many consumer brands, they have a narrower set of channels through which they are communicating to their end audience, so probably easier to establish some control. Whereas for a B2B organization that may have, it might be an account manager or salesperson initially, but then as you mentioned, you might have technicians, engineers kind of actually probably handling an awful lot of the day-to-day communications. So you could argue that actually there's even greater importance to establish that clarity around that tone of voice.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One of the former editors of The Guardian lives down the road to me, and I was chatting to him about the challenge that he had every day about all of the words that used to go into the printed newspaper, and he had to read every single word. What a huge challenge that is. And he had to guide his team of journalists to communicate in the Guardian voice with the Guardian point of view. And then I went back home and I literally got an old envelope out, and I started jotting down some numbers on the back of an envelope. And I thought, if you look at the managing partner that's looking after communications for a professional services firm or an IT firm or any kind of B2B firm, I wonder how much language they have to control each day. And we said, yeah, sure, there's the tweets, sure, there's the ads that go somewhere, or there's the white paper that goes out, once every quarter, once every month, whatever it is. Yeah, but then what about all the emails that are flying out of the business to their clients? What about all the pitches that are going on? What about all the board papers that are going on that are being created internally? What about all the chairman or CEO statements that are being released? What about the investor relations that's being released? What about all the communications that are going out into the recruitment space? And I started adding all of those up, and I realized that the managing partner or the chief marketing officer of even a medium-sized professional services IT business is responsible for producing more words each day than that ex-editor of The Guardian had to put into the newspaper each day. Now, the ex-editor of The Guardian, he was trained all his life on words, and he was immersed in what The Guardian's point of view was. But the managing partner or CMO of this professional services firm, they don't have that training. And it is absolutely critical for them to understand what is our brand voice, what is us, what is not, and give them the skills and the confidence, really, to get it right and to define their voice in a way which is absolutely true for their business, uniquely true for their business, and adds value to their business like every other part of what they're trying to do.
I appreciate it's probably quite a lengthy, complicated process, and I'm not going to ask you to give away all your secrets, but perhaps you could just share one example of a kind of practical exercise, a workshop, task, or whatever it might be, of how you might, because I imagine initially a lot of these concepts must appear quite abstract, particularly to the kind of individuals who might be sitting in senior roles within fairly traditional B2B and professional service organizations. So have you got an example of a task that might help kind of bring some of these concepts to life, a way of extracting some of the kind of like the essence of the brand that you can then use to kind of formulate that tone of voice?
Dan, your question is a really good one. How can you extract what is quite esoteric or theoretical sometimes about this is who we are as a business, this is why we're more highly valued or why we're differentiated as a business? What would be the brand? And how can you turn it into something which some people think is even more abstract, which is how do you express that in words? And so the on ramp to that could be I'm frustrated, we just don't sound as a business like we're different. The on ramp to that could be why are we slowing down as a business in our communications, and why can't we get out of the door what we needed? The on ramp to that might be signing off version 12 instead of version 2 of a piece of copy, or it might be the dreaded phone call from the chairman that says this isn't us, what's going on? They're generally the on ramps, and those on ramps to thinking about how do we create a brand tone of voice which is distinctly us. Those on ramps, if you like, crystallize the role of the brand voice. So generally at that moment, it becomes not an abstract thing, it becomes a very real thing. And I don't mind sharing our view of what you need to do with the brand language, particularly, Dan, because it's going to be coming out in my book later on in this year. But really, if you remember what I said about the slide deck, the 120 slide PowerPoint deck, which claims to define all of the brand's identity. And slide 114 is the brand tone of voice defined. What's almost worse than TBC to be confirmed is just seeing 4 bold adjectives on that page, particularly when those adjectives are human, friendly, warm, and approachable, because no writer can write like that. And of course, those things are nonsense. Really, when you're defining a brand voice, what we've looked at working with Alphabet's Moonshot factory, an amazing place called X, which houses Waymo, driverless cars. It's brought to life contact lenses which measure your blood glucose level, balloons high up in the stratosphere which provide internet to isolated communities below them. When we're defining a voice for any business which is complex, really the voice needs to be defined on the 3 levels on which it operates. So, right, an old reference, Dan, but Seinfeld. I could show you 5 lines of script from Seinfeld. And if you know Seinfeld, you'll say, that's George speaking, that's Jerry, that's whoever. Because just in those, say, 30 words, what's really clear out of what the character's saying, even if, just seeing it as a script, is their view on the world, the kind of tone or personality that they have, and some very specific language they use. And that's how all communications work. They work on these 3 levels. What we call the 10,000 meter level is the overarching narrative. So this is the world we believe in, this is what we stand for, and this is what we stand against. At 1,000 feet, you have the brand personality emerging, the tonal values, what a lot of people say is our brand tone of voice. And then you have the ground level details, which are the particular words and phrases we use and words and phrases we don't use, or the grammar we use. My grammar was taught to me 40 years ago. So is it still applicable in the real world today, or is there a kind of modernization of grammar? Short answer is yeah, absolutely there is. Sentence length. Do you speak like Ferrari in these long, technically constructed sentences, or do you speak like Minnie, 3-word sentence? So those 3 levels all need to be defined. Up at 10,000 feet, who are we? What's the world we believe in? What do we stand for? What do we stand against? Almost if you define that for the brand voice, your writers, anyone communicating for your business isn't going to go wrong because they're pointing in the right direction. They're going to say the right thing. Imagine the Guardian, the guy back at the Guardian. This is our worldview. This is what we stand for. This is what we stand against. Almost what we choose to write or the angle we take on any news story is going to be right if I'm very clear about those. Now, to make it even more Guardian or to make it even more like us as a business, what are the tonal values at 1,000 feet? Now, obviously, those tonal values, they have to be resonant, or they have to be reflective of what's going on at 10,000 meters. So in that rare situation in which the Sun newspaper in the UK and the Guardian newspaper in the UK took the same angle, the same worldview on the same story, they would still be written quite differently, because the tonal values of the Sun are quite different to the tonal values of the Guardian. The Guardian is much more, you could define three values. They might be campaigning, intelligent, and comprehensive. And the tonal values for the Sun might be intuitive, pushy, matey, something like that. They could take the same story, have the same worldview on it, which I doubt would ever happen. But even the way they write it, because of their different tonal values, would make it a very different experience to read. And you'd be communicating quite different values. And even down on the ground level, the words and phrases they use and don't use would be quite different. And the sentence length would be quite different. And the grammar choices would be quite different. The Sun seems to like 17-word sentences, which are also single paragraphs. The Guardian, longer sentences often, many sentences in a paragraph, more technical jargon. So think about a law firm. Do we call a law, down on that ground level, do we say a law firm, do we describe ourselves as us, we, third person plural, or do we do second person plural, or a second person singular, the firm? Do we always talk about the firm? This business believes, or do we say we believe? Those choices down, they're actually choices down at ground level in that situation, but they reflect what's going up in tonal values. Are we embracing, open, familiar, or are we quite severe, strict? And even going back up to 10,000 meters, our worldview is people need to respect a law firm for our superior knowledge and insight and trust us through that. Or is our worldview, for too long, clients have been in awe of their legal firms and subject to their legal firms' whims, and actually we see our clients as being on a peer level with us, and together we resolve things much more quickly. Long answer, Dan, sorry, but there you go.
No. And absolutely, I didn't want to interrupt because it was so good. For 10 years, I've been talking to people about these things, and I've never heard such a comprehensive but clear explanation of brand tone of voice. Even as someone who is fully bought into the concept, I've still always had a slight suspicion towards brand tone of voice, that it is just something inescapably kind of vague and abstract.
Well, it is, right? And even the expression brand tone of voice, I'm trying to break the world from using, because the brand tone of voice is one level. And I remember when we worked with B2B and B2C businesses. And I remember when we worked with Fred Perry, the CEO of Fred Perry had a real bee in his bonnet. He said, do not call them stores, because stores is an Americanism. We are a really thoroughly British brand. So our shops are shops, ground level. And I'm sure that B2B businesses, all businesses, have these words and phrases they like and don't like, that we use and we don't use. They have a way of communicating which is really clear. And getting all of those three levels, more than just the brand tonal values at 1,000 feet, but getting the overarching narrative, the worldview at 10,000 feet, and getting the ground level details, you need to get all three levels right. And you need to get all three levels resonant or reflective of each other. And then you've got a brand voice. And then suddenly you can sign off version 2 instead of version 12. And suddenly you have what is in the mind of the chairman or chairwoman being expressed. You can very quickly turn that into a piece of communication. Your tweets suddenly reflect who you are much better, rather than reflect the kind of social media dominant streams of way of talking.
And I think people probably have a stronger opinion on this than they realize. I think most people instinctively have those words and phrases that they go to, and certain words and phrases that they dislike or find slightly irritating. But because I think generally we talk about tone of voice in such unhelpfully vague terms, I think people fail to realize the kind of pertinence of it to them. But as I say, I think most of us have. I mean, even in my house, we have something called the smug mug, and in that mug, we put in words, a bit silly, but we put in words that we find irritating. There are certain words and expressions, things like spag bol is a particular word I have difficulty with. I think most people probably do have stronger relationships with words than they than they perhaps appreciate.
Yeah. And that's why we call the business verbal identity, because whether you realize it or not, you are creating identity for yourself, for your company, for your position in the company through the language you choose to use.
That's awesome. I wonder, how has the digital world affected this, if at all? And in particular, you see certain brands almost appearing to adopt slightly different tones of voice on different channels. So, a common example would be those brands that may be active on channels that are slightly more, or appear to be slightly less formal, where the content is a bit more kind of ephemeral in nature, like Snapchat and TikTok, where they suddenly adopt a slightly different tone of voice. Now, does that introduce some challenges? Because obviously, typically we associate tone of voice with consistency. We assume that that's a kind of integral part of it. Is that a misunderstanding? Is it okay for brands to talk a little bit differently in different contexts?
If you've defined your company or your brand's voice on three levels, then you're in a really good position to adapt your voice to different channels. You'll keep your voice, you'll keep your brand company voice consistent, but you'll flex it to suit the different environment. Imagine if you had someone who was always cracking a joke, just like anything you said, they were witty, fast comeback, kind of silly. What a great guy, right? And then you had the misfortune to go to a really somber, serious occasion and you wanted to take a great friend. Are you going to take that person? The wisecracker doesn't know when to stop. Always, no, you're not, because they've only got one way of speaking. What you want that person to do is to be able to turn up or turn down certain values in their personality to suit the occasion. And similarly in businesses, the way that you might communicate on LinkedIn, semi-professional, slightly a mix of professional and personal space, versus how you might communicate on TikTok, purely personal space, versus how you might communicate in investor relations. You still have to have, this is us as a business, and this is our differentiating, authentic voice of us. But if you've defined the voice on those three levels, what your writers can do is make sure that 10,000-foot narrative, they're choosing the right thing to joke and lark about on TikTok. They're choosing their worldview, their take on the world in the right way on TikTok. But also they're turning up and turning down those three or perhaps four tonal values that you've defined at 1,000 feet. So they suit the environment where the brand is communicating. You would think it crazy if a brand's visual identity, different color, different logo, different photography style, turned up in TikTok compared to turned up in a company brochure. You would say this company doesn't know who they are. Similarly, you want your brand voice to be consistent, whether it's in a customer service letter, chairperson's report, investor relations, brochure, pitch document. You want the tone of voice to be consistent in all those spaces, but you do need it to flex. And so defining the brand voice on three levels allows you in that middle level to turn up or turn down certain values. So you are more professional, more considered in your customer service letter. And perhaps in a note about a social event or something, you can turn down the absolute serious professionalism and turn up the dynamic or the warmth or another particular tonal value you've defined at 1,000 feet. So that's why we find that this way of defining the brand voice on three levels works really well, because you're never going to change your view on the world. You're never going to change the particular things you stand for. That will be consistent in all of your language communications. That's what keeps your brand voice consistent. But you do want to be able to turn up and turn down certain values according to the environment.
I love that. I think it's already so much clearer in my mind about how you can, as you say, kind of flex in accordance with the context while still staying true to the kind of bigger questions of who you are. Final question: can you actually attribute a financial ROI to this stuff? Or is that kind of missing the point? So if I was representing a large law firm, for example, can I look at this and say, if I do the things that Chris is advocating, we're likely to see some kind of measurable uplift in commercial performance in the foreseeable future? Or is that kind of missing the point? Is this more sort of long term direction of strategy than kind of shorter, medium term, kind of measurable results?
I'd like to zoom out from that question a little bit before we zoom back into it. I think a really good place to start is to say, how does our brand voice stack up against best in our industry sector? And then how does it stack up against best in the world in any other sector? When we worked with X, the Alphabet's Moonshot factory in California, we were really clear on what might be described as a competitive set, even though there isn't really a competitive set. Essentially, what they were using their brand voice to do was to attract literally the best minds in the world. They were competing against NASA, MIT, and cash-rich venture capital funds who were looking to sponsor startups. They had to say, we have to be so precise in our voice that people can really understand why they should come and join us rather than go to NASA or stay in their lab at MIT or be seduced by the money into this VC-backed startup. And when you're looking at that level, what you're trying to do is not say, first of all, what's the ROI, but saying, do we have a voice that differentiates and stacks up against best in category? And actually, let's be smarter about this. People don't just hear one category. If you are best in world, then you get best in world minds coming towards you. So that's zooming out. You can kind of zoom back in a little bit and say, before we look at the financial ROI, let's look at the human ROI. Are your people working weekends writing and rewriting or creating written communications? If they are, that has a human cost. They won't do that forever. And let's kind of zoom back into your question, Dan, if I can. I have something stuck up on the wall in my office, and it's a quote. The quote is, about halfway through the campaign, we figured out that of all variables that affect user behavior, design, usability, imagery, etc., copy has the highest ROI. Great quote. It happens to be from a guy called Dan Siroka, who was President Obama's election strategist, who got Obama elected the first time. People often say, do you need kind of great language for a business to go better? And I say, no, it's really like the oil in your car. If you're quite happy moving along, going as you are, you can have, bog standard oil in your car. But when you get to wanting to get the car to go faster and to do more and to be more responsive, you start looking at, can we get incremental advantage from the fuel we put in the car and the oil we put in the car? And that's what good language does. It allows you to be fast, it allows you to move faster, be more agile, and it improves the performance of the whole machine.
And I think, I mean, this is actually, it's a point that I often think about, often talk about, is that I think, particularly within the digital space, we like to make things so much about the mediums through which we communicate. We lose sight of the fact that everything is ultimately about the words that we are communicating, whether that's words within a video script or a tweet or an email or whatever it might be. And, if you go back a few decades, the highest paid, most championed communications experts were typically called copywriters, but we don't tend to appear to lend quite so much weight to it nowadays. I just wonder, is that a mistake that you see? Do you think that there is this kind of overemphasis on maybe being kind of a bit too channel centric, a bit too obsessed with technology, and not enough on the fundamental, words that we are communicating?
I kind of want, if I can, I'd like to answer that question slightly differently, which is the thought that only people with writer in their title are writing for the business is crazy. Everyone is writing for the business. We worked with a large IT firm in Italy, and they were growing so fast. I can't remember what their rate of kind of employee add-on was. It was crazy. I mean, they were big already, but they were adding 20% every 3 months or something. I mean, people were going to see clients together and they'd never met each other before. And they said, well, how would we use our brand voice, Chris? Where would we use it? And I would say, well, who's building the business? So you'd say, well, the account guys, going off and selling. Okay, but who's adding repeat business? Well, that's our field technicians. And I would say, well, how do they talk about the business? And they kind of put their head in their hands and go, I don't even, okay, so what if we gave them some skills about how they can speak on behalf of the business? How about if we give them some skills on using narrative, rolling our language, rolling the brand voice into narrative? And they said, let's do it. And they saw greater conversion rates. They saw greater repeat business attributed directly to their field engineers. So I completely agree. This era of only the writers writing was never valid anyway. But today, the walls of a business are permeable. And so everyone is communicating on behalf of a business. And they can be doing it speaking, they can be doing it in written language, and helping those people understand this is who we are, this is what we stand for, these are our tonal values, these are the words and phrases that we use and we don't use. They don't turn them into robots. They enable them, they allow them to be much more who they are and humans, and even better ambassadors of the business.
That's awesome. I feel like I've had lots of conversations like this over the years, but nothing quite as clear, quite as structured. And I think in a subject area that is on the surface so abstract, so vague, so ambiguous, I think by being able to kind of bring that more sort of not formulaic, but that more structured approach, I think I can see how that adds so much value. So yeah, thank you so much for your time.
I'm always happy to talk about this. Thank you.